This is the story of Marshall Calloway and his wife Valora Calloway. They had built something most people would call a good life. A house with a porch they rarely sat on, two children who still believed their parents were happy, and a marriage that functioned the way an old clock does, keeping time, but no one could say exactly when it had stopped being wound with care. The tension between them was not the loud kind. It lived in the pauses between sentences, in the way Valora laughed too quickly at her mother's jokes when Marshall was in the room, in the way Marshall had learned to read his wife's silences the way a sailor reads weather, not to engage it, but to navigate around it. What would unravel was not their love, exactly, but something quieter and more foundational, the loyalty they each thought the other owed, and the slow, private accounting they kept of every debt unpaid. This is a story about family as a system of reward and punishment, and what happens to a woman who finally reads the ledger. The Disney trip announcement arrived the way most things did in Valora's family, not as an invitation, but as a fact. Her mother, Constance, called on a Tuesday afternoon while Valora was folding laundry. She didn't say hello so much as she began mid-thought, as though the conversation had already been happening somewhere in her head and Valora had simply tuned in late. "We've booked the resort for the last week of July," Constance said. 5 nights, park passes, the whole thing. Your father finally agreed to use the points. Valora pressed the phone between her shoulder and ear and kept folding. "That's wonderful, Mom. Rowan and Petra will be thrilled." She was already calculating logistics, school year timing, Marshall's work calendar, whether Petra's motion sickness medication was still in the cabinet. "Oh, it's just the Florida cousins this round, sweetheart." A pause, cloth soft and deliberate. "We didn't want the group too large. You know how your father gets." Valora set down the shirt she was folding. "Right," she said. There was more, something about heat indexes and stroller rentals and how Aunt Denise's knee was finally better. And Valora made the appropriate sounds until the call ended. Then she stood in the laundry room with the unfolded shirt in her hands and stared at the wall for a moment longer than she meant to. She didn't tell Marshall that evening. She wasn't sure why, partly because she needed to understand it herself first, partly because explaining it would require admitting that her family had done something that couldn't quite be excused, and she had spent 20 years finding excuses. They ate dinner together, all 4 of them. Marshall had made pasta from scratch. He did that sometimes when he was home early enough and the mood struck him, and Valora had always found this particular tenderness of his more moving than she knew how to say. He taught Rowan, age 9, how to test the noodles by throwing one at the tile backsplash. Petra, 6, tried to copy her brother and hit Marshall in the elbow instead. The table was loud and warm in the way that could almost convince you nothing was wrong anywhere. Later, after the children were in bed, Valora and Marshall sat in the living room in the easy, tired silence of parents at the end of a long day. He was reading. She was looking at her phone without seeing it. "You're somewhere else," he said. Not an accusation. He said it the way you'd note the weather. "Just tired." He looked at her over the top of his book. Not the long look of someone trying to pry, just the brief look of someone checking in. "Okay," he said, and returned to reading. She watched him for a moment. Marshall Calloway was, in most observable ways, a patient man. He did not demand emotional performances. He did not fill silence with noise. He had, over 12 years of marriage, learned to wait, though Valora had never been entirely sure if this was a quality or a kind of surrender. She thought about telling him. She thought, "If I tell him, he'll say something measured and reasonable, and I will feel comforted in the moment and alone again an hour later." So she said nothing. The crack was already there, of course, had been there for years. The kind that develops in a wall slowly enough that you stop noticing it. But that phone call, that soft-voiced exclusion delivered in her mother's most casual register, had done something. Not broken anything open, just apply pressure in the way that eventually, over time, is the only thing required. She turned off her lamp first. Marshall stayed up another 20 minutes, the reading light still warm behind her as she lay facing the window, watching the shadows of leaves move on the glass. She had not yet asked why only the Florida cousins. She had not yet said to anyone, "My children were left out." But the question had lodged somewhere below her sternum, and she already understood, without wanting to, that she would not be able to leave it there forever. 3 weeks passed before Valora said anything, and by then the information had changed shape inside her. It had started as hurt, clean, simple, the kind that makes your eyes sting. But hurt has a short shelf life when it goes unspoken. By the end of the first week, it had become suspicion. By the second, a kind of archaeology. She was digging backward through memory, pulling up moments she had filed under. That's just how Mom is, and Dad didn't mean it that way. And looking at them again with different light. Her nephew Griffin, age 7, went to Sunday dinners with Constance and Harold more often than Rowan and Petra did. She'd always told herself this was geography. Griffin's parents lived 8 minutes from her parents' house, while Valora and Marshall lived 40. But geography didn't explain the birthday calls that came to Griffin's mother first. It didn't explain the school play her parents had attended for Griffin but forgotten about for Petra. She mentioned none of this to Marshall. What she did do, carefully, was call her sister-in-law Becca. Becca was married to Valora's younger brother Todd, and it was Todd and Becca's son Griffin who appeared, always, at the center of her parents' calendar. "Did you know about the Disney trip?" Valora asked. They were on the phone on a Wednesday, both of them in cars during school pickup. "Of course." Becca's voice was pleasant, matter of fact. "Constance asked us back in February." February. Valora had been told in April, after plans were finalized, after nothing could be changed. "She didn't mention it to me until everything was booked." Becca was quiet for a moment. A diplomatic, careful sound. "Did she say why she wasn't including Rowan and Petra?" "She didn't really explain it to us," Becca said. "You know how Constance is. She just makes decisions." Valora knew how Constance was. That was precisely the problem. That evening, Valora was quieter than usual in the way that Marshall could read but chose not to comment on. Not because he didn't care, but because he had come to believe, over years, that Valora processed things on her own timeline and that inserting himself before she was ready produced friction, not comfort. This was not entirely wrong. It was also not entirely right. They were washing dishes together, one of the few domestic tasks they still did in companionable closeness, standing at the sink in the low light after the kids were in bed. Marshall washed, Valora dried. They had done this 10,000 times. "Do you think my parents treat Rowan and Petra differently than Griffin?" she asked. Not loudly, as if she were asking about nothing in particular. Marshall kept washing. A beat passed. "I think your parents have a favorite branch of the family tree," he said. "And we're not on it. You've thought that for a while. A few years. You never said anything." He handed her a rinsed bowl. "You're saying something now, which means you're ready to think about it." He glanced at her briefly. "Are you ready to think about it?" She dried the bowl and didn't answer immediately. "I just want to understand the logic," she said finally. "I don't think it's logic," Marshall said. "I think it's preference, dressed up as logic." She set the bowl in the cabinet. The kitchen felt very quiet. "Maybe," she said, "it's also about me." She paused. "About what I've done or haven't done, what they expect." Marshall turned off the water and dried his hands slowly. He leaned back against the counter and looked at her with that particular attention of his. Not searching, exactly. Just present. "Then what would they expect you to do?" he asked. Valora opened her mouth. Then she stopped. She looked, briefly, past him, past the kitchen, past the present moment, and something crossed her face, some awareness, subtle and strange, as if she had suddenly felt the weight of being observed. "I don't know," she said quietly, almost to herself. Then oddly, "Maybe someone watching this knows." "I don't know." She shook her head, a small self-conscious movement, like this story, or never mind. Marshall frowned gently. "What?" "Nothing." She met his eyes. "I was just thinking out loud." He looked at her a second longer, then straightened and folded the dish towel. "Get some sleep," he said, not unkindly. She nodded. That night, lying awake, She let herself arrive at the conclusion she had been circling for weeks. Her parents didn't exclude Rowan and Petra because the group would be too large. They excluded them as a signal, and signals in Constance's family were never accidental. The question was what Valora was being told to do, and whether she was willing to do it. She drove to her parents' house on a Saturday alone. She told Marshall she was running errands, which was true in the way that technically true things sometimes aren't. Her parents lived in a colonial-style house on a street of colonial-style houses, orderly, well-maintained, the kind of neighborhood that communicated something about its residents' relationship with appearances. Her mother had hung new wind chimes on the porch. Her father's truck was in the driveway. The hydrangeas were blooming. Valora sat in her car for a moment before going in. Constance met her at the door with the pleasant, slightly surprised expression of someone who had, in fact, been expecting this. "Valora, come in. I just made coffee." Harold was in the den watching golf. He nodded at her and went back to the screen. Her father communicated in nods largely. "You learned to read their grades." Valora sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and waited while her mother arranged things. The sugar bowl, a plate of sliced fruit, the small performance of hospitality that preceded every difficult conversation in this house. "Mom," she said when Constance finally sat, "why aren't Rowan and Petra going to Florida?" Her mother settled her hands around her mug. She did not look uncomfortable. She looked prepared. "I told you, sweetheart, we wanted to keep it manageable. Becca told me you planned this in February. You didn't tell me until April." Constance tilted her head. "I didn't want you to feel obligated." "Obligated to what?" A pause. "To come." Valora studied her mother's face. Constance Halverson was a handsome woman in her late 60s, composed, capable, fond of the word practical as a blanket justification for any position she held. She had raised 3 children with high expectations and a particular talent for making those expectations feel, at the time, like love. "Are you saying you didn't invite my children because you assumed I wouldn't want to attend?" "I'm saying the trip was for the grandchildren who make an effort to be present in our lives." Her mother said it simply, not cruelly. The way she said anything she had already decided was reasonable. There it was. Valora set down her mug. "And you've decided Rowan and Petra don't make that effort." "I've decided," her mother said, "that you don't." The kitchen was very still. "We come to Sunday dinners when it's convenient. We came to Dad's birthday. Griffin's family didn't. They sent a card." Her mother's expression shifted, a small recalibration. "That was one occasion. I'm asking you to name what you actually want from me," Valora said. "Not the general sense of effort, specifically. What would make my children not be excluded?" Constance looked at her. For a moment, Valora saw something pass across her mother's face. Not guilt, not quite, but something adjacent. An awareness. "It's not a checklist, Valora. It feels like a checklist." "It feels," her mother said carefully, "like a daughter who moved 40 minutes away and assumed that would be fine, and wants to be treated as though she's present without the inconvenience of being present." The words landed. They were not entirely wrong. This was the thing about her mother. She was not a cartoonish villain. She was a woman with genuine wounds about proximity and attention, expressing those wounds through control because control was the only vocabulary she trusted. But her children were 7 and 9, and they had not chosen where they lived. "You're punishing my kids," Valora said quietly, "for a disagreement you have with me." Her mother looked out the window. "I don't see it that way. I know you don't." Valora stood. "That's the part that concerns me most." She left the plate of fruit untouched. She nodded at her father on the way out. He nodded back, a slightly different grade than usual. He had heard. He would not intervene. She sat in the car for a long time before driving home. She did not cry. She was past the part where she might have. The Florida trip happened in July without them. Constance sent photographs through the family group chat. Rowan and Petra were included in this chat, which Valora had come to understand was its own kind of cruelty. thoughtless rather than intentional, which was often worse. Griffin in a Buzz Lightyear shirt. The Florida cousins in matching sun hats. Everyone smiling with that particular brightness that photographs from theme parks always carry. The overexposed joy of people who want to believe the day is as good as it looks. Rowan saw them on Valora's phone. Are those the cousins? Yes, baby. Are they at Disney? Valora looked at her son. He was 9, old enough to register that something was missing, young enough that the explanation could still be shaped. She had rehearsed a version of this. Grandma and Grandpa planned this trip for a specific group, and we'll plan our own special trip. She had planned to say it lightly, making it small. What she actually said was, yes, Grandma and Grandpa took them this summer. Rowan absorbed this. His face did the careful work of children who love their grandparents and are trying to file new information without damaging anything. Oh, he said, and went back to his book. That single syllable stayed with Valara for days. She and Marshall talked about it, not immediately, but eventually, in the way they had found worked better, not in the heat of the moment, but in the cooling down period, sitting on the back steps in the evening while the kids were inside. Do you want to reduce contact? He asked. I don't know what I want, she said honestly. He was quiet for a moment. I think, he said slowly, that whatever you decide, you have to decide it because it's what's right for your kids. Not because you're hurt. Those might lead to the same place, but the reason matters. You always do that, she said. Do what? Make it more complicated? Make what more complicated? Being angry. He looked at her, something warm and a little tired in his expression. I'm not trying to take your anger away. I just don't want us to burn things down in it and then regret it. She understood what he meant. She also understood that this quality of his, this careful, measured refusal to be reactive, which she had always appreciated intellectually, had sometimes made her feel, in her lowest moments, profoundly alone. As if his steadiness was not a gift offered to her but a wall she couldn't get past. She had never told him that. Meanwhile, her mother had begun her own quiet revision of events. Valora heard it through Todd. Constance had told people, with the gentle sorrow of someone who has been misunderstood, that Valora had stopped bringing the children around, that she'd pulled back, that she wasn't sure what had happened, that she hoped they could work through it. None of this was entirely false. All of it was arranged in the wrong order. The revision bothered Valora less than she expected. She had watched her mother curate narratives her entire life. What bothered her more was that some people believed it, family, friends. Her aunt, possibly Todd himself, who had taken to calling with a slightly over-careful warmth, the kind people use when they're trying to maintain neutrality. She did not post anything publicly. She did not broadcast the photos or the conversation in her mother's kitchen. She had thought about it. Briefly, some impulse toward record, toward proof, but there was something that felt cheap about it, some loss she wasn't willing to incur. This was private grief. Making it a document would change it into something else. In September, she enrolled Rowan in a weekend soccer league. The parents sat along the field in portable chairs, and she found herself, one afternoon, sitting next to a woman named Diane, whose parents had died when she was in her 30s. I think I envy people with living parents for a long time, Diane said, watching her son's knee-high attempts at midfield strategy. Now I think, I don't know, there's a particular grief in having parents who are present but not yours, not quite yours. Valora said nothing for a moment. Yes, she said finally, there is. December arrived the way it always did in this family, with Constance's carefully worded invitation to Christmas Eve dinner, transmitted through a group text with a menu attached and a request for dietary restrictions. Valora stared at the message for a long time. She responded that they would come. Marshall, reading over her shoulder, said nothing. She wasn't sure if his silence was approval or the particular neutrality he had learned to maintain on everything related to her family. The silence of a man who had offered his perspective and been heard and had decided. Wisely, that offering it again would not help. They went. The house smelled of pine and her mother's beef tenderloin and the particular warm spice candle Constance had burned every December for as long as Valora could remember. Griffin was there with Todd and Becca. The Florida cousins had come up for the holiday. There were 12 people at the table, which was the right number to keep conversation general and therefore safe. Rowan and Petra ran with the cousins. Children are forgiving in their bodies even when they aren't yet sure how to be forgiving in their understanding. Petra fell asleep on the sofa before dessert. Rowan showed Griffin something on his tablet. After dinner, Valora found herself standing at the kitchen counter beside her mother, both of them wrapping leftover food. The room was warmer than the rest of the house. There was noise from the other rooms, her father's laugh, Todd's voice rising over something on the television, the specific high-pitched sound of children who should be in bed. "Thank you for coming," Constance said. She said it sincerely. Her mother was sincere often. This was not in question. Valora reached for the foil. Of course. They worked for a moment in silence. "I've been thinking," Constance said, "that maybe next summer we do something that includes everyone." Valora kept rapping. "That would be nice." "I think your father would like it." "He doesn't say so." "Dad rarely does." Her mother smiled. A real one, the kind that made her look briefly younger. "No." A pause. "You're so much like him. You both go very quiet when you're hurt." Valora looked at her mother. Constance was not looking back. She was attending to the food with that methodical care she brought to tasks when she was feeling something she hadn't found language for. The statement had arrived without apology attached, without explanation, without the structural acknowledgement of harm that Valora had, at various points over the past year, imagined she needed. It was just an observation. You go quiet when you're hurt. It was, possibly, all she was going to get. She understood this the way you understand something that has been true for a long time and that you've simply stopped arguing with. Her mother was not going to say, "I was wrong to exclude your children." She was not going to say, "I was punishing you, and that was unfair." She would say next summer, "Everyone," and she would mean it, and it would not include a reckoning because Constance did not conduct reckonings. You could want her to be different, or you could wrap the leftovers. "I know I go quiet," Valora said. She set the foil-wrapped dish aside. "I'm working on it." Her mother looked at her then. Something passed between them, not forgiveness exactly and not its absence either. Something older than both, the recognition that this was the shape of the thing and had always been and might always be. "You're a good mother," Constance said. It was the most she could offer. Valora knew it. "I learned from someone," she said. She didn't mean it entirely without edge, but she didn't mean it entirely with one either. She carried the dish to the refrigerator and went to find her children. Marshall was in the doorway of the living room watching Rowan describe something to his grandfather. Harold, leaning forward in his armchair, hands clasped, listening with more visible attention than he usually gave anyone. Rowan's hands moved with the particular expressiveness of children who have not yet learned to contain themselves. Marshall looked at her when she came to stand beside him. He didn't ask how it went. He reached over and briefly, without ceremony, held her hand. Then let it go. She stood in the doorway and watched her son hold her father's attention, and thought about the photographs from July, the ones she hadn't been in, the ones her children hadn't been in, and she felt the grief of it move through her like something passing through water, real, present, and already on its way to somewhere else. She did not know if next summer would be different. She knew her mother believed it would, and that her mother's beliefs were not always reliable maps. She knew that Rowan was 9 and would, very likely, remember none of this. She knew that Petra wouldn't. She wasn't sure what she would remember. Maybe this, the smell of her mother's kitchen in December, the sound of her son's voice, her husband's hand, brief and warm, the distance between what a family is and what you needed it to be, the slow work of living in that distance without letting it hollow you. She stayed in the doorway. She didn't go back in. She didn't leave. She just stood there in the warm space between rooms, in the noise and the light, and let the evening be what it was.